She called me the wrong name at our wedding, not by accident. I watched her do it. The slight pause before she said it, the small smile after. My husband laughed it off, said she was nervous. That was the first day of our marriage. It took me 4 more years to understand that it was also a warning. This is the story of how my mother-in-law destroyed my marriage from the inside, and how I finally stopped letting her. My name for this video is Anna. Everything I'm about to tell you is real. The dates are real. The things she said are real. The slow, methodical, almost invisible way she inserted herself into every corner of my marriage until there was no room left for me, all of it is real. I'm telling this story because when I was living inside it, I spent years thinking I was the problem, that I was too sensitive, that I couldn't take a joke, that I was the difficult one, the one who couldn't just get along, the one making everything harder than it needed to be. I want to talk directly to every woman watching this who has ever been made to feel that way by the woman who raised her husband. Because what I eventually learned, what took me years and one very good therapist to understand, is that there is a specific, recognizable, well-documented dynamic at play in families like the one I married into. And once you can see it clearly, once you have the language for it, the fog lifts. Not immediately, not painlessly, but it lifts. My mother-in-law's name was Patricia. She was 61 when I met her, recently retired, with an enormous amount of time and emotional energy, and nowhere productive to direct either of them. She had 1 child, my husband, Daniel. 1 child she had raised alone after his father left when Daniel was 7. 1 child she had organized her entire identity around for over 2 decades. And then I came along, and I had the audacity to want to be his primary relationship. Stay with me, because what happened next is something I genuinely could not have predicted, and something that I think far more people will recognize than are willing to admit. I met Patricia 6 weeks into dating Daniel. He was warm about it, excited even. He wanted us to meet, he said, because she was important to him, and he had a feeling I was going to be important to him too. I found that sweet. I went into that first lunch with genuine goodwill, wearing a dress I felt good in, with a bottle of wine I'd spent too long choosing. Patricia was charming. Effortlessly, almost professionally charming. She asked about my work with what seemed like real interest. She complimented my earrings. She told a self-deprecating story about her own early career that made me laugh. I drove home thinking I had been lucky, that I was one of the women who got a good one. A mother-in-law who was warm and funny and genuinely happy. Her son had found someone. I told my best friend that night that I thought it was going to be fine. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it's important. Patricia was not immediately difficult. She was not cold or hostile or openly unwelcoming. If anything, she was the opposite. Almost too warm, too interested, too present. She texted Daniel within an hour of our lunch to say how much she'd loved me. She suggested we do it again soon. Just the 2 of us, girls' lunch, get to know each other properly. I was charmed. What I did not yet understand was that the charm was the first move. Not a conscious, calculated move necessarily. I've spent a long time thinking about how much of what Patricia did was deliberate and how much was simply the unconscious expression of a personality that had never been asked to share the most important thing in her life. I don't have a clean answer. What I know is that the warmth in those early months served a specific function. It established her as the reasonable one, so that later, when things became difficult, when I started to have feelings about her behavior, the established narrative was already in place. Patricia was lovely. Patricia adored me. If I had a problem with Patricia, the problem was mine. Daniel and I dated for 2 years before he proposed. In those 2 years, Patricia and I saw each other regularly. Family dinners, holidays, occasional one-on-one lunches that I initially looked forward to and gradually began to dread without being able to clearly articulate why. The dread had a texture I struggled to name. It wasn't that she said anything overtly awful. It was more like, after every interaction with her, I felt slightly smaller than before it, slightly less certain of myself, slightly more aware of my own inadequacies in ways that felt specific to her presence. She had a talent for the comment that wasn't quite a criticism, the observation that wasn't quite an insult, the question that carried, if you listened carefully, an entire judgment inside it. Have you thought about what you'll do when you have children? Will you keep working? Said warmly, over salad with a smile. I found myself explaining my career choices to a woman who hadn't asked for an explanation. That was her gift, making you explain yourself without ever having accused you of anything. We got engaged on a Thursday in October. Daniel proposed at home privately, which was exactly what I wanted. I had told him early on that I wasn't a public proposal person, that I'd find it mortifying, that I wanted it to be just us. It was perfect. We called our families that night, and everyone was happy, and I went to bed feeling like my life was exactly where it was supposed to be. Patricia called the next morning before I was awake, not to congratulate us. She had done that the night before. She called, I would later find out, to tell Daniel that she thought we should have a long engagement. At least 2 years, she said. She had concerns, not specific ones she was willing to name. Just a feeling, a mother's instinct, that we were moving fast, that she wanted to make sure Daniel was sure. Daniel did not tell me about this call for 3 weeks. When he finally did, after I'd noticed he seemed distant and asked him directly what was going on, he framed it as something he hadn't wanted to worry me with, something he'd handled. I asked him what he'd said to her. He said he'd told her we were happy and the timeline was ours to decide. I asked if she'd accepted that. He paused before answering, which told me everything. What I did not understand then, but understand now, is that this phone call was the opening move in a campaign that would last the entire 4 years of our marriage. Patricia had understood, the moment the engagement became real, that she was losing something. Not Daniel's love. She was confident enough in that. She was losing her primacy, her position as the most important woman in his life. And she was not going to accept that quietly or gracefully. She was going to fight for it. Not with open hostility. That was never her style. She was going to fight for it with a set of tools so subtle and so deniable that by the time I could clearly see what was happening, they had already done most of their damage. The wedding planning was the first real battlefield. Patricia had opinions about everything. The venue, the flowers, the guest list, the menu. She expressed these opinions not as demands, but as suggestions, always framed as being for our benefit, always delivered with a self-effacing disclaimer, "Of course, it's your day. I just thought. I only mention it because." She wanted to invite 47 people that Daniel and I had never met, her friends, her colleagues, her neighbors, people who had known Daniel as a child and who she felt deserved to witness this moment. We had agreed on an intimate wedding, 80 people maximum. Adding 47 of Patricia's acquaintances would have more than doubled that. Daniel said we'd think about it. I said no. This was the first time I said no to Patricia directly, and it was the first time I saw what lived underneath the warmth. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She went very quiet in a way that was somehow louder than shouting, and then she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Of course, it's your wedding." And then she called Daniel 4 times in the following week. I know because he told me each time that it was nothing, just his mom checking in. Everything was fine. Everything was not fine. But I didn't yet have the standing to say that out loud without sounding like the woman who was trying to come between a son and his mother. So I said nothing. We got married. She said the wrong name. Daniel laughed it off. And we began. The first year of marriage, I have largely blocked out in the specific way you block out sustained low-grade pain, not dramatically, not with a clear before and after, but with the gradual numbing that comes from an unpleasant thing that never fully stops. Patricia was present in our marriage in a way I had not anticipated and did not know how to address. She called Daniel daily. Not every few days, daily. Sometimes twice. Long calls, the content of which Daniel was vague about when I asked, in the way you're vague about something when you know the specifics would upset the person you're talking to. She had a key to our apartment. Daniel had given it to her before we were married, for emergencies. And when I raised the subject of getting it back after the wedding, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, something closer to fear. Like I had asked him to do something that carried consequences he didn't want to think about. We did not get the key back. She used it 3 times in our first year to let herself in while we were out. Each time there was a plausible reason. She'd been in the neighborhood. She'd wanted to drop something off. She'd thought we'd be home. Each time Daniel thanked her. Each time I smiled and said nothing and went to the bathroom afterward and stood at the sink, gripping the edges with both hands. The thing about Patricia's intrusions, and I want to be precise about this because I think it's important, is that none of them were, in isolation, clearly unacceptable. A mother who calls her son. A key used for legitimate drop-offs. Opinions about a wedding that were ultimately not followed. Take any single incident and hold it up to the light, and it looks like nothing. Like sensitivity on my part. Like me being the difficult one. That's the architecture of it. The incidents are designed, again, consciously or not, to be individually dismissible. It's only the pattern, the cumulative weight of 100 small intrusions over months and years that reveals what's actually happening. And the problem with patterns is that by the time you can see them clearly, you're already deep inside them. By the end of our first year, I had started to feel like a guest in my own marriage, like there were 2 people in my relationship, Daniel and Patricia, and I was a third party who had been permitted to move in. The conversation that broke something open happened on a Sunday afternoon in our 3rd year. Daniel and I had plans. Nothing significant. A day to ourselves, something we'd both been looking forward to after a particularly heavy few weeks of work. Patricia called that morning and asked if we wanted to come for lunch. Daniel said yes before he'd finished the sentence. I watched him say it from across the kitchen and felt something go very still inside me. I didn't say anything in the moment. I waited until he'd hung up, and then I said, quietly, that I thought we had plans today. He said it was just lunch. It wouldn't take long. His mom had mentioned she'd been feeling lonely. I said that she mentioned she was lonely every time we had plans, and that I had noticed this, and that I was starting to feel like our time together was always the first thing to be given away. He told me I was being unfair, that his mother was alone and that family was important, and that he didn't understand why I found it so hard to be flexible. I said I didn't think flexibility was the issue. He asked me what the issue was then. And I really tried, standing in that kitchen on a Sunday morning with my coffee going cold, to explain the thing I had been feeling for 2 years without the language to name it, that I felt like our marriage existed inside his mother's marriage to him, that I felt like I had never been fully first, that every time I raised anything about Patricia, I became the villain of the story, and she remained untouched. He listened, and then he said, and I want to quote this exactly because I have replayed it so many times that I could not misremember it if I tried. He said, I don't know what you want me to do. She's my mother. She'll always be my mother. As if I had asked him to choose. As if wanting to be his primary relationship was the same as asking him to abandon her. We went to lunch. I sat across from Patricia for 3 hours and smiled and answered her questions and watched her touch Daniel's arm every time she made a point and felt, with a clarity I hadn't had before, that I was not going to be able to do this forever. I just didn't know yet what not doing it forever was going to look like. I started therapy 8 months before I left. I want to be clear that I did not start therapy because I had decided to leave. I started therapy because I had begun to experience anxiety symptoms severe enough that I couldn't ignore them anymore. Difficulty sleeping. A persistent tightness in my chest that my doctor had ruled out as physical. A habit of mentally rehearsing difficult conversations so compulsively that I was doing it in meetings, in the shower, lying awake at 2 a.m. My therapist's name was Dr. Christine Holloway, and she had a quality of attention that felt, in those early sessions, almost aggressive. Like she was listening not just to what I said, but to what I didn't say, and finding things in the gaps. In our 3rd session, she asked me to describe a typical week. I did. She asked me, at the end, how much of my mental energy in a given week was spent managing my relationship with my mother-in-law. I thought about it honestly and said probably 40%. She didn't react dramatically. She just wrote something down and asked me what the other 60% was spent on. That question, so simple, so direct, was the beginning of something. Because when I tried to answer it, I realized that most of the remaining 60% was spent managing the consequences of the 40. Managing Daniel's moods after Patricia had called, managing my own feelings about not having addressed something, managing the gap between the marriage I thought I was in and the one I was actually living. There was very little left over for anything that was simply mine. Dr. Holloway introduced me to the concept of enmeshment, the psychological term for a family dynamic in which boundaries between individuals are blurred or absent, in which one person's emotional needs consistently override the system's ability to function healthily. She was careful not to diagnose Patricia, whom she had never met. But she helped me understand that what I was describing, a grown man who could not disappoint his mother, who experienced my needs and her needs as being in direct competition, who had never been given the tools to separate his identity from hers, this was not a character flaw. It was a developmental pattern with a name and a literature, and importantly, a set of implications for the people who loved him. The implication most relevant to me was this: Daniel could not give me what I needed without first doing work he had never been asked to do. Work on his own relationship with his mother. Work on his own sense of where he ended and she began. I suggested couples therapy. He agreed, and then canceled the first appointment because Patricia had called with something that felt urgent and turned out not to be, and then agreed again, and we went 4 times before he said he didn't think it was helping and stopped going. I kept going alone. And slowly, over the following months, I built enough of a floor under myself to be able to see clearly what I needed to do. I moved out on a Wednesday in March. Not dramatically. There was no fight that precipitated it, no final incident, no moment where something snapped. There was just the quiet, accumulated weight of 4 years of being a secondary character in my own marriage. And the morning I woke up and understood with complete clarity that I had been waiting for Daniel to change in a way he had not demonstrated any real intention of changing, and that waiting was its own choice with its own cost. I told him the night before. The conversation was long and painful, and in the way of conversations between 2 people who genuinely love each other, but have broken something that neither of them fully knows how to fix. It was also strangely tender. He cried. I cried. He said he hadn't understood how serious it was. I told him I had tried to show him how serious it was many times, and that I believed him that he hadn't understood, and that his not understanding was itself part of what I was leaving. He asked if there was anything he could do. I said I thought he needed to talk to a therapist, alone, about his relationship with his mother. that I thought that was the only thing that could have made a difference, and that I wished we'd gotten there earlier. He nodded. He didn't argue. Patricia called him while I was packing a bag. I heard him in the other room, his voice low, and I didn't listen to what he said. It didn't matter anymore. What I want to say? To end this. To say the thing I most wish someone had said to me when I was 3 years into a marriage that was slowly disappearing and couldn't understand why. Is this: wanting to be first in your own marriage is not a demand. It is not selfishness. It is not an ultimatum or an attack or a failure to understand the importance of family. It is the most basic, reasonable expectation that exists inside a partnership between two adults who have chosen each other. If you are watching this and you recognize the dynamic I've described, the daily calls, the key, the comments that aren't quite criticisms, the husband who loves you but cannot disappoint her, the feeling of being a guest in your own relationship, I want you to know that you are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You are not the difficult one. You are a person in a real and well-documented situation, and there is language for it, and there are people who understand it, and you deserve a marriage in which you are not competing for the position of most important person in your partner's life. You deserve to simply have it. I'm 2 years out now. I live alone in an apartment with good light, and a cat I adopted 6 months after leaving, and I am, in the specific, hard-won way of someone who has done significant work to get there, genuinely okay. Better than okay most days. I think about Daniel sometimes, not with anger, mostly with a kind of sad clarity. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had never been asked to grow up in one specific and important way, and who, when asked, found that he couldn't. At least not in time. Maybe he has since? I hope so. I mean that. If this story resonated with you, subscribe. Every week we go deep on real relationships, real psychology, and the stories behind human behavior that nobody talks about honestly. Share this with someone who needs permission to name what they're experiencing. And if you're in the middle of something like this right now, you're not alone. Not even close.